Perhaps no other body of liturgical text has inspired so great and diverse a company of composers as has that of the Requiem. Traditionally, a Requiem, also known as a Mass for the Dead, or by its Latin name, the Missa pro Defunctis, is a Mass celebrated for the repose of a soul, and is frequently, but not necessarily, celebrated in the context of a funeral. The term is also used for similar ceremonies outside the Roman Catholic Church, especially in the Anglo-Catholic branches of Anglicanism and in certain Lutheran churches. The Mass and its settings draw their name from the introit of the liturgy, which begins with the words Requiem aeternam dona eis Domine. Grant them eternal rest, O Lord. While there are some similarities between the texts found within a Requiem Mass and an ordinary Mass, there are also considerable differences. There is no Gloria and no Creed, and the Agnus Dei is slightly altered. Additionally, the Dies Irae is an obligatory part of the Requiem Mass. As its opening words, Dies Irae, or Day of Wrath, indicate, this poetic composition speaks of the Day of Judgment in fearsome terms. It then appeals to Jesus for mercy as it closes with the famous text, Pie Jesu. The Anglican Book of Common Prayer contains no Requiem Mass, but instead a service called the Order for the Burial of the Dead. Within the service are several texts stating that they shall be said or sung by the priest. These texts are typically divided into 7 parts and are collectively known as the funeral sentences. Composers who have set the Anglican burial service to music include Thomas Morley, Thomas Tomkins, Orlando Gibbons, Henry Purcell, and the most famous setting by William Croft. Musical settings of the portions of the Requiem Mass are also called requiems. This term is used to describe any sacred composition that sets the religious texts of a funeral to music. This term has also been used more generally to describe compositions written for liturgies other than the Roman Catholic Mass, and for musical compositions associated with death and mourning that lack specific religious or liturgical relevance. Among the earliest non-Roman Catholic examples are the German settings composed in the 17th century by Heinrich Schütz and Michael Pretorius. These were Lutheran adaptations of the Roman Catholic Requiem that later provided the inspiration for the mighty German Requiem of Johannes Brahms. For many centuries, the texts of the Requiem were sung to Gregorian melodies. The Requiem by Johannes Achegem, written sometime in the latter half of the 15th century, is the earliest surviving polyphonic setting. Beginning in the 16th century, more and more composers set the Requiem Mass to music. Indeed, the Requiem Mass is notable for the large number of musical compositions that it has inspired. Originally, such compositions were meant to be performed in liturgical services with a simple chant. Eventually, the dramatic character of the text made the Requiem a genre entirely of its own, attracting interest from composers with little or no prior experience in liturgical composition. This style of Requiem writing began in the 18th century and continued through the 19th, with composers producing what were effectively concert works that employed large forces and often lasted a considerable duration. These features prevented them being readily used for ordinary funeral services. The Requiems of Gossec, Berlioz, Verdi, and Dvorak were essentially dramatic concert oratorios. To date, over 2,000 Requiem compositions have been composed. There is great variation between compositions in how much of the liturgical text is actually set to music. Fauré, for example, omits the Dies Irae, while the very same text had often been set by French composers previously. In the 20th century, the Requiem evolved into several new directions. The genre of war requiem is perhaps the most notable, which comprise compositions dedicated to the memory of people killed in times of war. These often include extra-liturgical poems of a pacifist or non-liturgical nature. For example, the War Requiem of Benjamin Britten juxtaposes the traditional Latin text with the poetry of Wilfred Owen, while Krzysztof Penderecki's Polish Requiem includes a traditional Polish hymn. Another recent requiem was composed by Hong Kong composer Man Ching Donald Yu in remembrance of the victims of the 2008 Sichuan earthquake. The 20th century also saw the development of the secular requiem, written for public performance without specific religious observance, such as Frederick Delius's Requiem, completed in 1916, and dedicated to the memory of all young artists fallen in the Great War. Christopher Wood's Requiem was inspired by the public reaction to the death of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. In February 2013, an Arab Spring-inspired Requiem by composer Rami Khalif was premiered by the Qatar Philharmonic Orchestra and the Leipzig Radio Choir to great critical acclaim. The Requiem of John Rutter is regarded as his greatest contribution to the world of serious choral music. The Requiem was written in 1985 and dedicated to the memory of his father, who had died the previous year. Requiem does not adhere strictly to the conventional Catholic liturgy, but combines texts from the Requiem Mass itself, the Scriptures, chiefly the Psalms, and the 1662 Book of Common Prayer. The 7 movements of the work form an arch-like structure as they meditate on the themes of life and death. Within the work's frame, movements of a similar character are paired together from the outer movements to the inward. The first movement comprises the Requiem Aeternam and the Kyrie eleison, while the closing Lux Aeterna is a hauntingly beautiful movement that expresses serenity, light, and the promise of eternal rest. This final movement opens with the last verse from the Anglican burial service sung by the soprano soloist, which leads seamlessly into the Lux Aeterna, which finally returns to the opening Requiem Aeternam theme for a peaceful conclusion. For the 2nd and 6th places, he places the 2 psalm settings. He begins darkly with Psalm 130, or the De Profundis as it is sometimes known. Out of the deep have I called unto thee, O Lord, begins with an unaccompanied cello solo in C minor, which later gives way to a more positive C major at the words, For with the Lord there is mercy, and with him is plenteous redemption. His treatment of the 23rd Psalm is entirely different, and in stark contrast to the 1st Psalm setting. The Lord is my shepherd is perhaps the best known, best loved, and most consoling text in the entire Psaltery. These words he chose to set in English using the version found in the 1662 Book of Common Prayer. Moving inward again, movements 3 and 5 are personal prayers to Christ. As with the requiems of both Fauré and Duruflé, the Pie Jesu focuses on the soprano soloist, though in this case with the addition of a subdued choral commentary. In the Agnus Dei, the Latin text alternates with verses from the burial sentences, taken from the 1662 Book of Common Prayer. The central movement of this work is that of the Sanctus and Benedictus, celebrating the glory of God and ending in a brilliant and exciting Hosanna. Stylistically, Rutter writes in a happy mélange of musical styles. They are supplemented by a few references to Gregorian chant melodies, which the composer feels are the fundamental basis of Christian sacred music. There are grand moments, such as the pleading Agnus Dei, which build to an anguished forte, and the Sanctus as an affirmation of divine glory. The Pie Jesu for treble voice is ravishing. However, it is often the simple and elegant passages, such as the plaintive Requiem Aeternam, that capture the mood of the listener. Although using conventional harmonies, Rutter is not averse to throwing in a stinging dissonance for dramatic effect. Chant-like unisons suddenly burst into 8-part chords, and chromatics are used to intensify rather than change keys. Of his work, the composer says, "In writing it, I was influenced and inspired by the example of Fauré. I doubt whether any specific musical resemblances can be traced, but I am sure that Fauré's Requiem crystallized my thoughts about the kind of Requiem I wanted to write. Intimate rather than grandiose, contemplative and lyric rather than dramatic, and ultimately moving towards light rather than darkness, the Lux Aeterna of the closing text." The first complete performance took place in October of 1985 in Dallas, Texas, as it happened, and no one, least of all the astonished composer, could have predicted the flood of performances which continued ever since. Though it necessarily has its dark moments, Rutter's Requiem is unmistakably optimistic in its message of hope and comfort, expressed through the beauty of the chosen texts and Rutter's uplifting music. For many, the work stands as a clear sign of humanity's quest for solace and light amidst the darkness and troubles of our age.